There's a mother somewhere in America right now, sitting in her car in a parking lot, about to call her daughter, and she's rehearsing the conversation before she's even dialed. Not because she has anything difficult to say. She just wants to ask about the weekend, maybe mention a recipe, maybe ask how the new job is going, and she's running through every possible sentence first, checking each one for anything that might sound like pressure, or judgment, or too much. She used to just call. Now she prepares for it like a presentation, the way you'd rehearse before walking into a meeting where one wrong word could cost you something you can't afford to lose. My name is Margaret. I'm a mother and a grandmother, and I want to talk today about something that doesn't get nearly enough attention in conversations about family closeness. Not the dramatic estrangements, not the years of silence, but the quieter, more common experience of parents who are technically still in contact with their adult children, who still get the calls and the visits, but who have slowly learnt to filter almost everything they say through a kind of constant internal editing, because some past comment, some old disagreement, made it clear that the wrong word at the wrong moment could cost them the relationship entirely. If you found yourself rehearsing text to your own child, deleting half of what you wrote before sending it, you are far from alone in this, and there's real psychology behind exactly why it happens. Here in America today, researchers who study parent-adult-child relationships have identified a specific dynamic that's become increasingly common, one some family therapists now informally call relationship walking on eggshells, even though it rarely gets discussed using that language outside clinical settings. It tends to develop gradually after one or two pointed conversations where an adult child clearly communicated, directly or through a period of distance, that certain topics or tones were no longer welcome. Maybe it was a comment about their relationship. Maybe it was advice about parenting their own kids that landed as criticism. Maybe it was something said in anger that got walked back immediately but never quite forgotten. After that moment, many parents describe an almost permanent shift in how they communicate, where every future interaction gets quietly run through the filter of, will this be the thing that pushes them away again? What's worth understanding here, and what almost no parent going through this realizes at first, is that this filtering response is not a character flaw or a sign of weakness. It's a documented psychological pattern that researchers studying close relationships call hypervigilance, and it shows up in all kinds of relationships where someone fears losing a connection they value deeply. The brain, once it has learned that a relationship can become unstable, starts treating ordinary interactions the way it would treat a genuine threat, scanning for anything that might trigger the same outcome again. This is exhausting, and it's also completely rational, given what your nervous system has learned from experience. The problem isn't that you're being careful. The problem is how much of yourself gets quietly edited out in the process of being that careful. Now, I want to be honest about the other side of this, because that's what we do on this channel. Many adult children who have asked for more space or who reacted strongly to a particular comment in the past are not trying to make their parent feel like they're walking on eggshells permanently. Researchers who study boundary setting in adult family relationships have found that most boundaries, when an adult child sets one clearly, are meant to address a specific behavior or topic, not to put the entire relationship under permanent surveillance. The trouble is that boundaries are often communicated once, in a moment of frustration, and then never revisited or clarified again, leaving the parent to generalize from that single moment into a much broader, much more restrictive set of rules they impose on themselves indefinitely. Your daughter may have meant, please don't comment on my parenting choices in front of my husband, and you may have quietly translated that over the following months into, don't offer any opinion about anything in her life, ever, about anything. That gap between what was actually asked and what got internalized is where so much of this exhausting self-monitoring actually comes from. Here's what almost no family therapist says publicly enough, and it's worth hearing directly. A relationship built entirely on one person's constant self-censorship is not actually a stable relationship. It's a fragile piece that depends on you continuing to disappear in small ways indefinitely. Researchers who study long-term family closeness have found that relationships where one party consistently suppresses their own needs, opinions, and natural way of communicating tend to become quietly resentful over time, even when both people would describe the relationship as currently fine. The parent doing all that editing often doesn't realize how much energy it's costing them until they're asked to describe honestly what a normal phone call with their child actually feels like internally. Many describe something closer to relief when the call ends than warmth during it. That's worth sitting with, because it's not what closeness is supposed to feel like, and noticing it isn't a betrayal of your child, it's information. There's a specific version of this that researchers note comes up constantly with grandparents, and it's worth naming on its own. Many mothers describe the self-censoring intensifying considerably once grandchildren enter the picture, because now the stakes feel even higher. It's not just about preserving your own relationship with your child anymore. It's about preserving access to grandchildren you may only see on a schedule someone else controls. Studies on grandparent relationships have found that this particular fear, the fear of being limited or cut off from grandchildren as a consequence of saying the wrong thing to their parent, leads many grandmothers to suppress even reasonable opinions about things like screen time, bedtime, or discipline, well beyond what any actual boundary their child set would require. The grandchildren become, without anyone intending it this way, the highest stakes audience for every word a grandmother chooses or doesn't choose to say. This is exhausting in a particular way because it adds a second relationship's fragility on top of the first, and it's worth recognizing as its own distinct pressure rather than simply folding it into general caution around your adult child. So what does the research actually suggest doing about this? Because staying silent forever clearly isn't sustainable, and going back to saying whatever comes to mind clearly carries real risk. Family therapists who work with these dynamics tend to recommend something in between, built around clarity rather than either extreme. Instead of guessing indefinitely what topics are safe, some parents have found real relief in asking directly, during a calm moment unrelated to any specific incident, what their adult child actually needs from them going forward. Not as an accusation, not as, why can't I ever say anything to you, but as a genuine low-stakes question. What would make conversations between us feel easier for you? This single question, researchers note, often produces a far more specific and far more manageable answer than the broad, anxious self-censorship most parents default to in its absence. The actual ask is almost always smaller and more specific than the version a worried parent has been guarding against. There's another piece of this worth naming, especially for the mothers watching who feel like they've lost track of who they even are anymore in these conversations. Constantly editing yourself to preserve a relationship can start to feel like the price of admission for staying close to your own child. But researchers who study healthy long-term family bonds consistently find that the families who maintain real warmth over decades are not the ones where one person disappeared the most successfully. They're the ones where both people gradually found a version of honesty that didn't require either side to perform a smaller version of themselves indefinitely. That version of honesty usually takes longer to build than the silence does. It also tends to last considerably longer once it's there. Across the United States, this particular pattern, parents quietly self-censoring around adult children to avoid triggering distance, is becoming one of the more common, least visible forms of strain inside families that look completely fine from the outside. Nobody at the holiday table would guess that you've been rehearsing your sentences in the car beforehand. It doesn't show up as a fight or a missed visit. It shows up only in how tired you feel after calls that are supposed to be easy. If you recognize this in your own relationship, I want to leave you with something gentler than a fix. You don't have to solve this by tomorrow's phone call. You can start by simply noticing, the next time you're editing a text before sending it, what you actually wanted to say in the first version. Not necessarily sending that version, just noticing it. That small act of noticing is often the first step researchers see in parents who eventually find their way back to something more honest and more sustainable with the children they love. If this is part of your story, tell me in the comments what it's like for you, rehearsing conversations with your own child before you have them. So many of you have been quietly doing this for years without a name for it, and there's real comfort in knowing how many other parents are sitting in their own cars tonight doing exactly the same thing.